Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you to BDFI for inviting me to chair today's session. I'm super excited for Rebecca's talk. As Hayley says, my name is Viv Kuh. I am a lecturer in responsible innovation in the School of Chemistry, but I am not a chemist. I work with PhD students in science and engineering, teaching them responsible innovation, which is a relatively new thing. But fundamentally, it's about working with researchers right at the beginning of their career to help them grapple with the futures and impacts that their research may create and for whom those impacts are created. And the way that I do that is through creative methods. We make art, we play games, we employ critical making in all kinds of different ways. So I'm going to be your chair today. This is how it's going to work. Rebecca's going to talk for about 30 minutes. We're then going to have 20 minutes for questions. We'll take some from the room and some from our audience online, and then there'll be some time afterwards for a bit of a chat and a cup of tea. So to start off with, I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Rebecca Coleman. She is a professor in the Bristol Digital Futures Institute and also in the School of Sociology, Politics and International Studies. She was previously at Goldsmiths, University of London and Lancaster University, and her research and teaching spreads across sociology, media and cultural studies, and feminist theory. She's particularly interested in time, both futures and presents, and more recently, the kinds of futures imagined by people who are not usually involved in the design and implementation of digital technologies. And today in her BDFI Introduces talk, Rebecca is going to be telling us about some of her experiments where she's used interdisciplinary and image-based methodologies to explore these ideas and ask whether they might help us better understand how social differences and inequalities are produced and maintained through everyday digital technologies. As I say, I'm super excited to find out more, as I'm sure you are too. So over to Rebecca.
Thanks so much for the introduction, and thanks for coming, especially in the rain here in Bristol. Thanks too to the BDFI team who do lots of work behind the scenes to make this happen as well. So today, as Viv said, I'm going to try to draw together some different research projects that I've been working on over the past few years. And these are about time, they're about futures, they're about affect or feeling, and digital media and technology. So in some ways, it's a bit of a paper that kind of looks back at some of my older work and understands it in the context of BDFI. But I'm also trying to take seriously the title of the seminar series. So I see this as a way of introducing myself to you here at Bristol. So in particular, I'm interested in drawing out the futures aspect of BDFI and its relations to the kinds of digital worlds that we do and that we might want to live in and with. So I said in the blurb for the paper that I'd start with a series of questions about futures, inequalities and differences. So thinking about what might a focus on futures offer to understanding social differences and inequalities, thinking about whether people's and organisations' capacities to imagine, to plan for, to invest in and to make futures may be unevenly distributed. And if so, if the answer to those kinds of questions are yes, or it might be useful to focus on futures here, what does this tell us about how differences and inequalities are made and also might be challenged or kind of made in different ways? So I'm a sociologist by training, and so my interest in social differences and inequalities might be kind of unsurprising perhaps. But talking to some of our community partners about digital futures over the past year or so, the future has often been framed to me as a luxury or a privilege. So that it's not possible, or that it becomes really difficult to imagine the future when people are concerned about the immediate present. So here we might think about how the temporal horizon is kind of right now. It's not far away, but it's kind of right here. Sociologist Anne Misch might describe this in terms of the reach of the future. So she talks about the degree of extension that imagined futures have into the short, middle and long term, which may vary by socioeconomic class, background, and may also be rooted in institutional, subcultural or political orientation. So that's kind of one way of thinking about futures. Or we might look to the work of cultural theorist Lauren Berlant and their concept of cruel optimism. And this is the idea that the ideal of the better future functions as a pull, and this both at the same time works to kind of keep people going, and especially people at the bottoms or the margins of highly unequal societies. So it gives people something to work towards, and it's optimistic in that way. But at the same time, and kind of in doing this, it binds them to, and it kind of maintains these difficult presents. So it doesn't change or challenge the present. It defers social change and social justice, and it's cruel in that way. So at the same time as kind of noting the future as a privilege, the same organisations that I've been talking with have signalled how important the future is as something that needs kind of investing in. We need to keep imagining that the future can and should be better. And these views resonate with those from feminists, from queer, from Black and anti-racist, and other kinds of minoritarian movements. So as just one example here, and you can see that on the slides, Bell Hooks argues that the kind of feminism that she's interested in gives us hope for the future, and that this is a way of ending domination and changing the impact of inequality. So there's lots more I could say about Misha's work, about Berlant's work, about Hooks's work, and lots of other work as well. But for now, what I want to do is take up these ideas that access to an imagination of futures are not the same for everyone, and that we can see both the appeal of and the kind of lack of projection into the future as involved in the kind of the making and remaking of inequality. So I'm kind of answering that first question to say, yeah, I think if we focus on the future, that can tell us something important and interesting and productive about inequalities and differences. So what I want to do is I want to kind of hold this idea together with and perhaps in tension with, so it's not a neat kind of holding together, the need and the impetus for the creation of different and better futures. And that's, oh, maybe I've gone too far. Yeah, so that's really what I mean by this idea of future politics, or what I'm trying to capture with this idea of future politics. That futures aren't neutral or inevitable, but they're always political in the sense that they are contested. Put far too simply, we might ask who gets to have a future, who gets to imagine and circulate which futures, how do futures function to attract and or repel people? But we might also ask at the same time how we might facilitate the imagination and materialization of different and better futures. So the way in which I'm kind of using futures, and we can talk more about this later on if you're interested, is that futures are inherently part of everyday life. And this also shapes my understanding of digital futures. So I'm interested in the ordinary and sometimes mundane ways in which digital technologies pattern and make life. This idea that futures are everyday and that they're political was really highlighted to me in a recent collaborative project I've been involved in on time and the COVID-19 pandemic, where I worked with Dawn Lyon from the University of Kent, Corinne Van Emmerik and Chloe Turner, who are both at Goldsmiths, as well as a broader research team. So we collaborated with Mass Observation. This is a long-running archive that records everyday life in Britain. And they work with a panel of volunteer writers to respond to what they call directives, which ask the volunteer writers a series of questions about a particular theme or topic. So we commissioned a mass observation directive asking writers to reflect on how time was made, experienced and imagined during the first year of the pandemic. This was a time that really brought kind of people's awareness of the changing experience of time to kind of new levels. This was a really kind of heightened sense of how time was changing, whether that was in changes in kind of everyday routines or habits, but also kind of this projection into the future. So we asked writers to tell us about how time in their daily lives might have changed or stayed the same, to look back on their experiences of time and COVID so far, and consider what it means for their life to get back to normal, if it is, in the present day, and imagine what you think the future might hold. And it's quite interesting reading this now, because this went out in the summer of 2020, and even then there was this kind of impulse to kind of things to get back to normal. And of course we can think about how you know, what is normal? Are we back to normal? Do we want to be back to normal now? That you can find the full directive on the mass observation site, but we had over 200 responses, and what came out really strongly from them was how the future became uncertain during the pandemic, so that writers found it impossible or kind of really difficult to imagine. So one wrote that the future, absolutely no idea, and later, I just can't think of what the future might be. So this was echoed across quite a lot of the responses. So mass observation writers tend to be women, they tend to be older, middle class, and based in the south of England. At the moment, mass observation don't collect information on race and ethnicity, so we don't have that information to hand. But we might say that these are the people who might in some ways be assumed to be privileged enough to be able to imagine a future. And we recognise this leaning of mass observation. And so in the project, we also designed and ran field tanks with young people in London and Kent, prioritising those from marginalised groups where we could. So field tanks are a kind of focus group where a group of people come together and discuss a particular feeling. So in our case, a feeling about time and the pandemic. And they've really been developed by Chloe Turner, who co-designed and facilitated the project field tanks. And there's more I can say about those if you're interested in. But one we designed at really short notice. We were planning to do an in-person one, and then the number of COVID cases in the school that we were working at rocketed, and we weren't able to go in, so we had to design an online session at really short notice, and we stretched what we thought a field tank could be. So what we did was we asked participants not just to talk about feelings about time and the pandemic, but to create their own diary and make art on work that are similar questions to what we've done in the mass observation directive. And while these were a very different demographic of participants, we could see the connections as well as differences in how futures were imagined as impossible. So here, talking about the ways in which plans and experiences had kind of changed, and this kind of difficulty of imagining the future. So during this extraordinary period of the pandemic, then we can say that the condition of not being able to imagine the future became much more widespread, not only experienced by those who are marginalised, but also by those who are in more secure positions. Again, lots more I can say about this, and lots more relations with futures were kind of talked about. But I think what it enables us to reflect on are those questions about who is able to imagine, plan for, invest in, and be certain of a future, but also how we can explore these questions empirically. I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a minute. So these questions become significant in relation to our digital lives, in which digital futures are being designed and made, whether or not we kind of know about them, or we want them, or we're kind of involved in them. So for the past few years, I've been working on a project about the digital mediation of time and how people feel about this. So I've been especially interested in how digital media are seen to create these kinds of live or always on or kind of accelerated cultures. Part of this research has involved working with young people in a school in Southeast London about their feelings about social media and time, including workshops in which a group of people, a group of young people were asked to visualize their experiences of time and social media. So a few examples here, but we can see across these artworks that the young people, a major part of the young people's time is spent online and on all of these different kinds of apps and platforms. So they're kind of on and off. Some they're kind of on or kind of running in the background kind of most of the time. in a further activity, they visualised their feelings about time and media, creating images, including one that showed frustration, one that shows a kind of being absorbed in their phone and not noticing what else is going on up there on the top right. Yeah, your top right. Their likes and dislikes, and the relaxation that is induced here by Netflix and a McDonald's. So these experiences, though, were not only relevant to young people. Interviews with digital media professionals based in the southeast of England indicated similar feelings. So here I kind of use this relatively low-key visual method of asking participants to talk about the associations and feelings they made with the words. And we kind of map these out with post-it notes as we were talking, kind of moving things around. So one person I interviewed, Janet, who was a director of a digital at a large arts institution, noted the amount of bandwidth in that top quotation there required to just keep up with whatever is happening on social media, and saying staying on top of everything is a full-time job, and I already have a full-time job. And there's other examples of people kind of talking about similar kinds of feelings. So I've been trying to understand these experiences in terms of the kind of mediation of our contemporary lives and of the present, where there is this kind of feeling of keeping on and keeping up. So there's a certain consistency of keeping on social media or digital media, accompanied with this sense of keeping up with friends, with families, colleagues, influencers, and with kind of quick but also slower unfolding news events. And these include kind of practices such as checking, scrolling, kind of being notified, kind of refreshing all the time. And I've been trying to kind of think about this as quite a complicated and non-unified feeling. So it's not either good or bad. It can involve the exasperation of seeing a work message pop up at 11 o'clock at night, but it might also be about the relaxation of watching a box set or streaming something with a takeaway. So trying to really kind of hold on to the idea that this is not an either or feeling, but as digital media and affect theorist Susanna Parsonen puts it, it's an and feeling. So she talks about how the same object can result in virtually any kind of kind of affect or kind of feeling, and that these feelings can be ambivalent. So we need to be able to hold seemingly contradictory things together in dynamic tension if we're to be able to understand what we're studying with sufficient degrees of granularity. So I'm really kind of saying here that, you know, we kind of need to, in Donna Haraway's terms, kind of stay with the trouble, like it's not this or that. These can be very confusing, this can be very complex. In a similar way to what I was saying with this kind of future politics idea, it's not that, you know, the future is bad or that the future is good, but it might be both of those things for the same person at different kinds of times. So how do we hold those kinds of things together, but also how do we study? How do we empirically study those kinds of things? So, you know, this is the kind of backdrop of this kind of long research project that I've been doing for quite a few years now, and I will write into a book at some point. But I'm kind of so with that as the background, but also kind of still inspired by that kind of theory and those kinds of methods that want to hold on to an idea of the better future. So how might we make different futures? How can we explore and materialize and trouble or kind of change future politics? So for me, and I think there's kind of lots of crossovers here with Viv's work as well, this kind of interdisciplinary, collaborative, creative methodologies and methods are really productive ways to kind of begin to do this, or to think about how we might do this, to experiment with that. So I can say a lot more about my conceptualization of methods as interdisciplinary, as collaborative, as creative. And I'm learning such a lot from being here at Bristol with new colleagues, but that kind of collaborations between academics, creative practitioners, marginalised publics, and kind of the people who are involved in making, designing, kind of getting kind of tech kind of out there, it is really important. So I want to kind of begin to finish with 2 examples of recent work I've done. So as part of the COVID and Time project, we worked with 2 artists, Paula Varchak and Chuck Blue Larry, on an artist response to the research. And this was also with Emily Grabham at Kent. So the artists, Paula and Chuck, already had a really strong participatory research angle to their work. And we built on this to hold this participatory workshop with some of the students from the school in Southeast London. And they kind of reflected on time and the pandemic, but specifically on social media. It resulted in a short TikTok style video on an imagined app that Paula and Chuck made called The Time. And here's just some screenshots of it now. And it kind of features the artist, but it also features the students in the school as well, kind of playing around with memes, with apps that have become popular during the pandemic, and using these kinds of methods to really kind of articulate these feelings about digital media and the time of the pandemic. So, you know, feeling discombobulated, trying to kind of be like, what does it mean? How does it feel like to be on hold during this period where we can't imagine a future? And the artists were really sensitive to how they involved the young people as producers of the artwork, and they shaped their edits around kind of their feedback. So it was quite a long and kind of complicated process. Another example is a recent project I've been doing with Noel West Media Centre around post-pandemic hybrid futures. And this builds on the really amazing work that Noel West Media Centre have been doing in and with the Noel West community for a long time. But in particular, we wanted to build on their hybrid activities during the pandemic. So bringing together a kind of a mix of digital and physical spaces, and kind of building on what they've done with communities already, and especially a program called Come Together, where they were kind of quite creative with how they imagined hybrid activities. And again, we've kind of put the post-pandemic here in scare quotes, because it's not finished. It's still continuing in these uneven ways. But we were trying to think about how it might refer to this time now where we're kind of in between the days of strict pandemic restrictions and the return to normal. So, you know, how can we use this time to kind of reflect on questions like these here on the left? So what have we learned from spending so much time online as producers, audiences and facilitators of digital technologies? What have our experiences of hybrid spaces been? And what would we like to keep doing, and what do we definitely never want to do again? So really also kind of thinking about how questions of accessibility and inclusion that were raised by lots of people in terms of doing things online during the pandemic aren't kind of lost in a rush to return to just doing things in a in-person kind of way again. So the project had 4 main stages. You can see those there. So we were reflecting and reviewing on what Noel West Media Centre had done in terms of hybrid activities. We co-designed a series of potential hybrid activities for Noel West Festival in October 2022, which is an annual community festival hosted this year by Noel West Media Centre. And at the festival then, and this was the stage 3, we experimented and we kind of tested a variety of hybrid activities. So thinking about what would work in terms of community engagement, what would work in terms of Noel West Media Centre staff trying out different kinds of things, and also trying to be kind of creative as well. Like, how might we approach the idea of hybrid in a creative way? And then we did some evaluation and kind of and sharing. So I don't have time to go through all of the projects, but there is a joint BDFI and Knoll West Media Centre report on the BDFI website if you're interested, so you can find out more there. But I want to focus especially on that third stage where we tried out and we experimented with these different kinds of hybrid activities at Knoll West Fest. So through our co-design workshop, we came up with the idea that hybrid activities don't need to be live or synchronous. So we made TikTok style videos that went out before the festival on social media, which provided a sense of what the festival would be like in some quite mundane ways. So how would you get to the festival? Would there be chairs to sit on? Would there be quiet spaces to chill out? If you were kind of coming with different ages, what kinds of activities might there be that could keep everybody occupied? And these videos performed really well in terms of reach, but they also provided Knoll West Media Centre staff opportunities to try out new equipment. So they were partly filmed with a DIY proxy protest harness that they'd kind of learned how to use in earlier kind of work, but they hadn't been able to kind of actually kind of use them. We also ran 2 live stream videos on Facebook and Zoom during the festival to give those who weren't able to come a sense of what the festival was like. And this was the first time that Knoll West Media Centre had done live streams in these ways. One of the things we did during them is we asked people if there were particular activities that they felt they were missing out on, and we posted packs to them that gathered together some of the materials that were happening in the different activities on the day. So one person said that they felt sad at missing a macrame making workshop, so we sent them what they needed to do in order to kind of make their own macrame kind of hanging plant pot hanging plant plot holder. So we were also then kind of like trying to stretch this idea of liveness, or really kind of think about that hybrid activities didn't need to be live. We also did this through printing Knoll West postcards, which people could write to connect materially with people in other virtual spaces, and they posted them in a post box at the festival, and we later stamped them and really did post them on. So again, there's a lot more I could say about this project, but I really want to highlight the questions we asked. So in terms of that kind of last question there, we were really keen to centre the approaches and experiences of people in marginalised communities, in the Knoll West community, who had found online and hybrid activities more inclusive and accessible than in-person ways of doing things. So we were informed by, and this was kind of running throughout Knoll West Media Centre's work that they were doing, kind of critical approaches from disability communities, crit politics, thinking about who might be excluded from in-person events. We were also informed by feminist, anti-racist, queer work, all of which, like I've said, were kind of built into the many activities that Knoll West Media Centre do anyway. So, but I think we can think about this as part of this project of avoiding binary positions and thinking about the ways in which ambiguities and differences are built into digital cultures. So we found, I think, working with hybrid productive in particular because it forced us to think about the tensions as well as the overlaps and connections between virtual and physical worlds and experiences. So hybrid experiences are not this or that, but they're always both. We're both in the room here and there are people on Zoom. But more broadly, in terms of digital innovation, we might think about it as an example of how the experiences of people, and especially marginalised people, are involved not just at the end of a design process to evaluate the extent to which a particular technology is successful or effective, but can shape the direction of the project itself. So this was a really small project, and there were things that we could have done differently and things we could do differently with a bigger project. But this idea that kind of we're centering those kinds of questions in how we're shaping what we understand technologies to be and what they can do. So I can say more about this later on if it's interesting. But there's also the optimism of the first and the second questions. So asking about what we have learned and what we would like to keep on doing. So not assuming that digital futures are inevitably one thing, that they're already determined, but that we can ask what we want and how we might want to make those worlds. So alongside the idea of kind of creative methods as something that might kind of be creative, might do things differently. I'd also like to note that these were experiments. So Britta Tim Knudsen, Mads Krau and Carsten Stage describe experiments like this. So they say experiments have the ability to produce sensuous events that enable more or less intense shifts in attention and involve participants in orchestrated yet unpredictable processes that activate the body's ability to relate to sense and imagine the world in new ways. So there's a lot in that quotation, but for now we can focus on how experiments are orchestrated and yet unpredictable processes in which the world may be imagined in new ways. They're inherently future oriented, they're world making. So this is here in that second quotation where they say that this is a practice that is at once inherently unpredictable, but at the same time vested with the ability to open up new futures, and that might give otherwise hidden or invisible social logics a visceral form. So I want to finish then by framing the methods I've outlined here as experiments that explore future politics, and to try and do these kinds of future politics differently by starting in different places or accepting ambiguity, for example. More broadly, I think we might consider BDFI itself as an experiment in the kinds of collaborations that might be possible. So this is inherently unpredictable and it is difficult, but it's also exciting. And there's kind of all of this capacity there through which we might be able to imagine and create new digital futures.
Thanks, Rebecca.